Thank you for the intro, Kyle, and thanks everybody for making time. I know these are busy days and it's not always easy, especially if we're on site or doing the meeting shuffle to jump in and do some deep dives and learn more about what SBP does. Although, candidly, maybe our Caribbean stuff is some of the least known because it's some of the newer work that SBP has been doing. So, and Kyle, I can't tell if your screen is shared. There it is.
Yep.
Awesome. So this will be kind of a quick overview of SBP's kind of interventions in the Caribbean, starting with Puerto Rico in 2017. So while Puerto Rico is one of the operating sites that I don't oversee, it is kind of where we got our foothold in the Caribbean, it being a U.S. territory. In 2017, we responded to kind of the aftermath of Hurricane Maria, but Irma was also in there. They were about 2 weeks apart, caused extensive devastation to the utility. So the grid was offline for a number of months and maybe even years, depending on where you lived. It caused water problems, and it also caused massive damage to infrastructure and to housing. So in 2017, we deployed some folks from our US operations who did, I think, 4 different deployments for about 30 days before we eventually were able to set up a long-term operating site. And we are continuing to serve Puerto Rico through that operating site to date, which is nearing its 5-year anniversary. So the kind of second introduction into the Caribbean which was our first non-US based response, was in 2019 to Hurricane Dorian in the Bahamas. And Hurricane Dorian was a particularly nasty storm in that it was a Category 5 moving at like 1 to 0 miles per hour. It sat over the Bahamas for 3 full days before it moved on. So at SBP, we were positioned to respond stateside. We'd been doing some alerts to potentially impacted areas within like the cone of uncertainty. We were prepped and ready, and then it never came. So we asked the question, what are we going to do about the Bahamas? So in 2019, I was in a very different role. I oversaw some of our communications and marketing functions at SBP, and I actually deployed to the Bahamas. There were a number of us who deployed. Zach had gone down within 30 hours after the storm and had kind of gone down with a network of folks who had connections on the ground, either speedboats or small planes, to kind of survey. And then I followed 5 days after and was kind of trying to do some storytelling to help some of our funders, some of our supporters kind of understand how SBP could play a role in supporting, how we could take some of the funds that we had and provide impact, whether it was through a share intervention and another. I went for 5 days, and I have been in the Bahamas for 3 years now. I changed roles. There was just such an immense amount of need, and I think just dot connecting on the ground early on really helped SBP get a foothold and ultimately allow us to be one of the last groups remaining in the Bahamas who's rebuilding. And then in 2021, another disaster happened in the Caribbean, which was the St. Vincent and the Grenadines. The La Sofrere volcano erupted after 40 years. It covered much of the island in volcanic ash. There were mudslides, there were lahars that followed the eruptions. And for the better part of 9 months, about 20,000 people were living in temporary shelters provided by the government and the United Nations while they waited for the volcano to step back down and go dormant so that they could go back to their communities. So just looking at this, you can see 2017, 2019, 2021. In SBP's world, that's about every 2 years, there's something that we can respond to in the region. This is not an exhaustive list of all the disasters that have happened. Last August, there was the earthquake in Haiti. There was the 2 hurricanes that hit in Latin America, which was Iota and Eta, which were Nicaragua, Honduras. There's a ton of activity from hurricanes and other natural disasters that are happening in the region. What we have to do at SBP is kind of understand what our value proposition is and know that this is a place where we can come in, we can have support from the government, that we can kind of take our existing model and apply it to actually provide maximum impact. So not everything in the region is going to be a place that we're going to be a strong player or even play to our strengths. So we have to be very careful about how we approach where we can kind of, position ourselves to provide impact in the future. So if I were taking a guess at where we'll be, I'm sure that there will be another operating site or another intervention up here in the next year. Who knows? We're in the thick of hurricane season now, so it's kind of the nature of our work is that it is unpredictable when the next disaster is going to strike. Go on, Kyle. So what I want to kind of take a quick moment to highlight is really the key differences between our stateside operations and our, non-US operations in the Caribbean. So that would include Puerto Rico kind of in our traditional model, which is that it has AmeriCorps members, that we, can do things a certain way, whereas the operations that I'm overseeing in the Caribbean are structured a little bit differently. So the first key difference is going to be the governance and the coordination of the response, right? So in the States, we have FEMA, who does some of the immediate relief. So there's a saying that all disasters are local. And what that means is kind of two things, right? That the local government is going to be the shot caller in regards to the response, and they'll have federal assistance to support them, right? There's going to be technical experts and folks that come in that can provide resources to support the impacted community, but ultimately that they're looking for decisions to be made by the local organizations. Internationally, we don't have FEMA, right? That's a US based entity. In the region, we have CEDEMA, which is the Caribbean Emergency Management Agency. It's a regional body that kind of oversees different operations. And you also have the United Nations functions, which support the developing world with assistance. But similar to the way FEMA supports the local municipal government in the States, these entities also support the host nation. So the local government of the Bahamas or St. Vincent and the Grenadines or anywhere else. So ultimately, those governments can kind of choose and opt in to what aid that they want to receive and how they want to receive that. The second thing I would highlight is the difference in building codes and standards. In the United States, we have pretty rigorous building codes and standards. We have great processes for these. Ultimately, different states have different building codes. Some things that we've noticed over the years, certainly with the winter storm Uri in Texas, the differences are plumbing systems that go overhead when pipes burst from the freezing temperatures. They cause more damage because the building codes allowed for that in single story residence for plumbing to be overhead, right? So that meant replacing drywall on ceilings, as well as in the walls and flooring and stuff like that, versus places like Louisiana, where that's not a thing. In the Caribbean, what has happened over the years, many of these countries were under previous, whether it was England or France or the Dutch colonies, they kind of adapted their building codes from the previous regimes that were running it. What the difference is that there haven't been so much the same standards in enforcing those building codes. So while they have a building code, they're not enforcing it. They're not. So when you see the damage and the destruction in the region, oftentimes it is excessive because there's no enforcement of the building codes. Take, for instance, in the Bahamas after Hurricane Dorian, we had, massive storm surges that were sometimes up to 20 feet in certain areas of the island. That's people in their attics are, questioning whether this is a safe place to be. Many of the homes were swept off their foundations and carried out to sea. It was tragic, right? We did some assessments with some of the international groups, Engineers Without Borders, the local Port Authorities, Building Service Department, Red Cross, and others, and found that, in fact, it wasn't that the building code was deficient. It's that the buildings that failed were not built to the building code. So that meant that there was an enforcement issue or a gap in enforcement. The third and probably biggest difference is just how we set up our operating sites and our model, right? So in the US, we typically rely on what SBP has been founded on. It's built on is this traditional model of using AmeriCorps members and volunteers to rebuild homes after disaster as part of our build intervention. Internationally, that's not feasible because we can't use AmeriCorps members. It's also expensive for volunteers to travel and find housing, especially on small islands where we're trying to provide temporary housing for the impacted communities. So if we brought in a ton of volunteers and put them up in hotels and Airbnbs, where are the impacted, families going to stay? So there's just a limit to what's available. So that's one of the big things is that we do leverage a lot of subcontractors in our model. We try to put money back into the economy to bolster the economy when they've taken a ding. To kind of frame this in perspective, when the Bahamas was impacted by Hurricane Dorian right before the onset of the pandemic, about 1 in 4 to 1 in 5 Grand Bahamians on the island where we were working was unemployed as a result of the hurricane. So if you think about a tourist-based economy, a fishing economy, and you lose all of your boats, you lose all of your hotels are offline, all industry is offline, folks are in dire need. So it made sense for us to adopt this model so that we could, again, hire local vendors, hire local subcontractors to kind of put money back in the economy and move things forward. Fourth is resource scarcity. So we're talking about small islands, right? And small islands don't often produce all of the goods and services. They import a lot of things. So what SBP stateside has the benefit of is if the Home Depot and the Lowe's in the community where we're doing work are impacted, that we can source those materials from an adjacent community and bring things in relatively easily. When we're talking about an island, that's not the case, right? So we've got to buy something from the States, we've got to transport it to Florida, we've got to put it on a cargo ship, it's got to sail, so there's lead times there. In the Bahamas early on, we also had the port was damaged, so it meant they had a reduced capacity to offload these containers and get materials to the vendors. So it slowed things down and created almost like a 15-week lead time to get materials early on after the storm. So when I say resource scarcity, it means that we have to adapt our model, which is kind of based on like lean principles, the Toyota production system, which is to minimize waste, which part of waste we consider is excess inventory in our warehouse. That wasn't an option for us. We knew that the lead times were too long, that we needed to buy things in bulk and store them so that we could continue rebuilding at a predictable pace. And the fifth one, which is kind of different, vastly different than what we approach our stateside build operations, is you can't just rebuild houses if folks don't have access to medical care, if they don't have access to water. So if I rebuild 100 homes in this community, but people can't stay in their houses because they can't get medical care, they can't get potable water for drinking, cooking, showering, and sanitation, then we're not really causing full-scale recovery to happen. So we have to look at like, what are the barriers for folks to recover here, and how do we make sure that as we're addressing our build intervention, maybe there's some extra things that we can do to provide value and help the whole community recover. So I kind of mentioned it before, but when we were talking about Hurricane Dorian in the Bahamas, it's the worst storm that's ever hit the islands. It was a Category 5. It sat there for 3 days. 80% of the islands of Grand Bahama and Abaco were underwater. You had 20-foot storm surges that caused catastrophic damage and catastrophic loss of life. The reports of loss of life early on were like 40 or 50. What realistically happened was several thousands of Haitian refugees were killed, who were migrants to Abaco. There were search and rescue going on for months after the storm. As we were supporting some of the hospitals, there were still, recovery. There were still, individuals being found. There's still individuals who haven't been identified that are being kept in like storage, basically, in refrigerators because they just haven't had family to come and identify them yet. So with those 20-foot storm surges as well, like all of the water in the Bahamas is pumped from an underground aquifer. So the islands are limestone. So you have a confined aquifer within that, meaning it's like a layer of fresh water that can be pumped out of the ground that can go through a small treatment process and goes into all the homes and hospitals around the island. It's how they are supported. When you have a 10 to 20-foot storm surge that goes over the pumps and over the wells, all that salt water gets into the aquifer and now makes the water non-potable. It's not drinkable. It's not usable. And that is a persistent problem that 3 years after the storm has still not righted itself. So all of the water that's available in Grand Bahama and Abaco has to go through an energy intensive desalination process to be able to be used, which means we have to have equipment, trained technicians who know how to do this. We have to have standards for water, all of these things to make sure that folks can, which means there's an added cost to drinking water now. And I mentioned before hospitals and clinics. So you think about 10 to 20-foot storm surges. There were a number of hospitals on both of the impacted islands that went underwater. Some of the smaller clinics were completely wiped off their foundations and are no more and had to be rebuilt, which meant that it created an access problem for families that needed healthcare in those communities. They had to travel farther distances. They had to jump on a boat or a ferry to go to a different island to get seen by a doctor or a nurse for even something as minor as a cut that, or tetanus shot. So when we looked at interventions, one of the things that was interesting was that the Bahamas has experienced a number of hurricanes over the years, but most of those hurricanes have been high wind events. So Dorian with the flooding had created this new problem that Bahamians were not used to seeing, which was mold. So there was an opportunity for SBP to come in kind of early on, and we found some great partners on the ground with the building service department and the Ministry of Public Works to kind of offer mold remediation training. And what our government partners did was they were like, hey, this is news to us. What we want to do is create a PSA with you guys. We want to help you schedule some trainings in the communities. We want you to train some of our contractors. We want to get this out there, right? We know that even with the 7 or 8 nonprofits that are on the ground that are offering these services, that's not going to be nearly adequate enough to get all of the homes in any reasonable amount of time. So we went to work, we did trainings multiple days a week in different communities. We trained over 500 residents within 90 days, 30 contractors and others to kind of help address the massive need, which was mold remediation. One of the things that we did as well is SBP, you've maybe heard of Harvey Home Connect, or I think we've done it in West Virginia and other places, but it's a coordination tool. It's a common application. So what we want to prevent in disasters is basically assessment fatigue. You have a bunch of nonprofits that come in and they mean well, but we're going and knocking on the same houses. We're having people fill out the same type of information over and over again. And then folks are waiting and they're like, look, I filled out the same thing 6 times and nobody's come to help me yet. So we sat everybody down and said, we all have very similar vulnerability criteria. Why don't we just agree on what that vulnerability criteria is for all of us? We'll create one online application system. We partnered with the Grand Bahama Port Authority to build this online tool. And within 90 days, we had this up and running. Similar to what we've used in some of our other operating sites. And we had over 2,000 people apply within the first 24 hours on Grand Bahama. So it was a big success initially. So there were 7 nonprofits that were participating in the home repair program at that point in time, and addressing some of the mold remediation and rebuilding needs for Grand Bahama. Unfortunately, the pandemic happened a few months later, and a lot of these groups had to either pause or suspend their operations, and then many of them ultimately diverted funding and left. So what ended up happening was SBP was probably the primary rebuilding group using this online tool and still uses it to date to source clients and activate repairs. Another big need was the Rand Memorial Hospital. So it's the second largest hospital in all of the Bahamas, Grand Bahama Island being the second largest island, both in inhabitants, but also in like GDP. So the Rand Memorial Hospital is centrally located in Freeport, which is kind of smack dab right in the middle of Grand Bahama. And it went underwater by about 4 or 5 feet. They had to evacuate all of the patients and the staff, many of whom were at work when the storm hit. They lost their homes. So when we touched down in the Bahamas, it was 5 days after the storm for me. Many of them were still wearing the same scrubs that they were wearing 5 days ago. They looked tired, fatigued. And we knew that, frontline staff provide an invaluable service in that they're supporting community folks who've been walking through waist deep water after the storm, maybe have cuts, bruises, like dehydrated. So what we wanted to do was make sure that we were able to support the frontline staff at the Rand Memorial Hospital by bringing them supplies. So, hey, what are you seeing? Do you need electrolyte drink mixes? Do you need baby formula? Do you need more scrubs? So we kind of activated this, and there was a lot of people at SBP and our stateside operations, Anya, Amy, others who were kind of back in Florida organizing a bunch of these supplies. We were flying in sometimes as many times as 3 flights a day to support the Rand Memorial Hospital's operations. So we would meet with them in the morning and say, what do you need? We'd make a phone call. 2 hours later, there'd be a flight coming over with some supplies that we could kind of really immediately provide some impact. And what that did for us was we built massive rapport with the hospital. We were one of the groups that was kind of helping them daily with whatever like trouble they were running into so that they could continue just focusing on providing the support to the community while we would source the items that they needed. And that I can kind of talk through later, but that built a great partnership for us to devise more of a long-term solution to help them out. We also partnered with Team Rubicon. We did muck and gut mold remediation for about 1/5 of the hospital early on. And it took us about 3 weeks to get all of it done, right? It was a massive amount of square footage that we ended up demoing and doing mold remediation on. What was super interesting about that is ultimately Carnival Cruise came in and supported and funded some of the long-term like muck and gut and mold remediation for the other 4/5. They also gave some funding to support some of the rebuild. And it took them about 5 months to do the remainder of the muck and gut and mold remediation on the other 4/5 of the hospital. So the hospital would call us and be like, is there anything you guys can do to come back and help out? I know we like agreed to work with them, but they're really not working out. So it was really interesting to see how fast and efficient our teams were at something and how we did such a top-notch job, and that the government of the Bahamas, more specifically the Ministry of Health and Public Hospital Authority, was like valuing the work that we did. So it's just to prove what you're doing has great impact, whether you know it or not, like, right? So what we offer is a great service. One of the things we did was we looked at our build intervention. We said, there's a lot of need here and there's not a lot of help. There's no government programs that are in place to really support the rebuilding. There's no CDBG-DR funds. There's no HUD entities. There's no FEMA that can provide temporary assistance. None of these things exist here. So if we want to be able to help as many people, we have to look at what services we're offering and kind of change that a little bit. So we took a look at our scope of work and we said, well, if we want to help as many families as possible, because there may or may not be any government assistance that will come available, and there's only a few nonprofits, what can we cut out of our scope of work that's not going to ultimately, prevent people from recovering? It's going to put them in safe, sanitary, secure housing, but it's maybe not essential and it's an added expense. So we looked at all cosmetic things. So most of the homes in the Bahamas were built slab on grade, meaning they have a concrete floor, but a lot of homeowners had tile, right? Well, tile is not necessary to move back into a house. We said, well, let's take tile out of the scope of work. Let's take other cosmetic things like painting, like exterior paint, interior paint. Let's put drywall back up. Let's get the electric back on. Let's get the plumbing working. Let's get some kitchen cabinets in. Let's put a roof over their head, replace windows, exterior doors, interior doors for privacy. And like, we'll kind of cap it there, right? But that allowed us basically to save several $1,000s per home which allowed us to kind of maximize the funding we had. And it also created efficiencies in that the number of days it took to repair a home decreased significantly because we cut out some of the cosmetic stuff like painting that adds a little bit of time and expense. So to date, we've done about 483 repairs before the 3-year anniversary, which is September 1st. I think that number has probably gone up a little bit this week. I think we've completed maybe another 4 or 5 homes this week. So close to 500, we're closing in. We'll certainly exceed 500 repairs before the end of the year, but it's allowed us to really move fast when there's a massive need and not much support. It's very dry resource wise and funding wise. And kind of finally, the third one, which was really unique, and it was really tugged at my heartstrings when I was there, was the children's home. So the Grand Bahama Children's Home is, for lack of better terms, it's an orphanage. It cares for children who are between 10 months old to 13 years old in age, who come from traumatic backgrounds. These are children who are abused, neglected, orphaned, or just come from very traumatized backgrounds. They're cared for in this group living environment. They lost everything, and worse still, the home flooded. They had to be evacuated in the middle of the night. So you have kids who are being carried out by their caregivers in the middle of the night through waist deep water. They're put in these military transport vehicles. They're moved to a shelter. And then for the next year, they were basically sent to different islands, to different homes. Many of them are brothers and sisters. They no longer have any connection with the caregivers who were kind of their surrogate families caring for them for a number of years. So they're thrown in this totally traumatic experience. And then the pandemic hits. They can't come back. We're finishing repairs on the children's home. We're helping them kind of operationalize and understand how they can add capacity for a number of these children who are coming in who are orphans because they've lost family members in Abaco and some of the surrounding islands. So for us, it was like, how do we really help them, not just in rebuilding the facility, but also with like the long-term governance? How do we, a group that has to fundraise locally when everybody locally is going to be prioritizing their own repairs, how do we help them kind of increase their international fundraising presence, get their books right, know what they don't know so that they can maintain operations for the next few years and supporting the kids that are in their care. In our work in the Caribbean, there's been a lot of, certainly a lot of innovations and lessons learned. And I think some of these are, ultimately we've kind of talked through, but buying in bulk was something, right? So we take advantage of the duty-free concessions. We buy in bulk early on so that we have access to the materials that we need to rebuild homes. We looked at in-kind donations. So there's a number of groups that say, I can't give you money, but I can get you some stuff. What do you need? And we said, well, the thing that we're replacing the most is roofing, right? It was a Category 5 storm. It had 185-mile-an-hour sustained winds. We need plywood and we need underlayment. So like Gray Select, like the peel and stick. And we bought some of those, luckily, before the prices shot through the roof. We had those that could last us almost 2 years, and it was saving us somewhere between $2,000 to $2,500 per house per roof, which was a significant cost savings. So it's understanding what are like the best ways to buy in-kind materials. So something that's going to be very easy, it's not small, but it's something that you can use on many projects that's going to ultimately decrease your budgets and allow you to make better use of the dollars that you have. The third one that we do a lot different is our subcontractor negotiations. So the typical SBP operating site will take a project, we'll open that project up for multiple bids, we'll review and we'll say this one's the most cost effective and this is the contractor we'll use for the work. What we kind of had the benefit in Grand Bahama was it's a big island. There's a lot of subcontractors. There's very few people that are paying for work. So what we said is like, instead of like letting them kind of dictate and we're just kind of hoping we get like the lowest bid and then we're trying to walk them back, is why don't we just tell the contractor what we're willing to pay, right? Like this is the price point we need to be at. So if you're a roofer and you're doing work for this much, you can work with our program. If you're a plumber and you're installing a plumbing fixture, I don't want to like know that I'm paying one plumber $15 a fixture more than the next guy. I can say this is what we're paying for fixtures and it's reasonable. You're not going to get rich on this one project, but you'll make a lot of money if you can work on this over time with us. So we were able to get really good rates from our subcontractors because we kind of control the market. That's not always going to work in every situation. Certainly if we were working in Abaco where there was a lot of nonprofits with a lot of funding and very few subcontractors, the opposite happened. The subcontractors could kind of name their own price because those were the only folks that you could have, or you'd have to bring somebody in and pay for housing, but there was no housing. So for us, like this was a model, something that we adopted. It's something we'll consider using if the conditions are right, but it's certainly something different than maybe the traditional SBP model. And then kind of lastly, one of the things we looked at was we had a constrained budget, right? We were trying to do more with less. And kitchen cabinets off the shelf in the Bahamas were like $3,000 for a pretty basic, like compressed particle board cabinet that wasn't, and that was like 1/5 of our budget for the house. So we said, we've got to figure something else out. So we talked with our team in Puerto Rico who said, hey, we have these interesting PVC kitchen cabinets that we're building locally. We looked at those and we said, like the shipping cost to move them is a little bit much. So we outsourced that to China. We're able to get the price down per unit and ship those in. So now we have this waterproof, mold-proof kitchen cabinet option that we're using in the Bahamas that we've seen reasonable success with, right? Like, so it's when we're repairing homes, if there's another flood, this is something that you're not throwing the baby out with the bathwater, is the saying, right? You can wipe it down and reuse it. And that's one less thing that you have to, replace, or the homeowner has to replace. Two is it's one less thing for the sanitation department. So you think about the claw trucks that have to go pick up the debris. Imagine if 500 homes in one community have resilient cabinets and they don't have to throw that out. How much cubic yards of debris that is, and how much savings that there is from a sanitation standpoint. And that's less stuff that ultimately ends up in the landfill. So while PVC may not be the most sustainable product in the long term, if it's a community that floods multiple times a year or a decade, there's certainly, some measure of sustainability in using something that's a little bit less sustainably made in these kind of situations. So real quick, just so you can kind of get a picture, on the far left is a picture of our reverse osmosis system we put in at the Ram Memorial Hospital. So earlier I talked about how we kind of won the response, how we made these great connections with the Public Hospital Authority. One of the long-term projects we basically built a public-private partnership with them around was we want to make sure that the hospital has access to clean water in future disasters. So we scoped out a number of locations, the Ram Memorial being the kind of the biggest and kind of center of the project, and said, we want to make sure that you have access to at least 3 days worth of water, that you have a resilient system that can treat the water, and that your staff is trained to maintain the equipment long term. So we found 5 different locations, either hospitals or clinics around 3 different islands, that we put in similar systems and treatment options basically to treat the water, and it has added storage capacity. So in the event of a future disaster, not only are the hospital's needs met, because you think the increase in foot traffic of people who need medical care after disaster, you're going to need more water, but also that like there's systems. So in the parking lot of the RAN, there's PVC like spouts, so people can pull up with their cars and fill up water jugs and have access to clean water, that the staff has access to clean water when they leave. It's one less thing they have to worry about. So we did that at 5 different locations, some of them being very remote communities. And that's how they'll be able to support themselves in future disasters, is through this kind of resilient program. Top middle is our mold remediation crew. So we actually partnered with another foundation in the Bahamas and this disadvantaged youth group, and we trained them in mold remediation, and we mold remediated about 300 homes with them, which kept our costs down, but allowed them to learn a new skill set and gave them employment for the better part of a year and a half to 2 years, through the early part of the pandemic. And then we kind of had to pause some of our operations for a few months, but we picked back up and then wrapped up the program, and it enabled us to get a lot of the homes mold free so that we could start reconstruction. Bottom middle is we were approached by the government. So instead of HUD, we have the Disaster Reconstruction Authority in the Bahamas. It's kind of like the longer term group that addresses some of the housing needs. And they had been donated these like 40 modular homes. And they said, look, we got these. We don't have blueprints for them. We don't know how to put them together. Can you help us out? So our team took a day off. We said, all right, like, make sure you guys have heavy equipment. We'll need a crane to like unbox some of these things. Like if you can put that on a ferry and send it over. We went to an island or key called Sweeting's Key. It's about 40 inhabitants that we were looking to build some of these homes for. So we walked the government subcontractor and some of their contractors through how to put these things together, which was a great learning experience for us, but also helped, provide impact, because we take one day, show you how to do one of these, you can build the other 39 of these now. So it was a good opportunity to see the materials and the construction, but also like for us, it was, this is when people hype up modular, or when they hype up these accessory dwelling units and some of these kind of temporary housing things, you get a full like view of the value of them. So you look at the cost and you look at what it offers. And to me, ultimately 9 times out of 10, it's always going to be more feasible to rebuild the existing structure from a cost perspective and from a resilience perspective than to add some of these like makeshift things, because these things, if there was a strong enough wind, would not be something that I would want to be in. But ultimately, it was a great experience for the team to see it and actually kind of put their hands on it. And then on the far right, these are the PVC cabinets. It's 5 foot upper, 5 foot lower. We've actually kind of taken this design and we've modularized it, and we're now going to start using these in some of our stateside operations. So if you're in Houston, New Orleans, or other places, you've probably seen some of these in the warehouse, but I think we're going to start rolling these out soon for use. And I think there's a lot of potential for these, especially in areas where if homes are not elevated above the 100-year, 500-year floodplain, and you have to make certain improvements, maybe there's an option for SBP to partner with the local government to get these approved as a resilient measure. Maybe there's a way for us in the future to start working with builders, say the kind of cookie cutter, low to moderate income housing neighborhoods, to say, hey, like, here's something you should consider, right? Like if we can start using more resilient materials in homes to start, that's less stuff we have to fix later on. So St. Vincent, this one is probably news to a lot of you. So St. Vincent and the Grenadines, the opposite end of the Caribbean, we're very, very far south, almost Venezuela territory. But there's a volcano in St. Vincent, and in 2020, it started having some seismic activity that was detected. So there's monitoring stations like most volcanoes, and they kind of put some alerts out. And then a few months later, there were ultimately mass evacuations as the volcano became more and more active. A day later, an effusive eruption began on April 9th. So 20,000 folks were evacuated from the northern parts of the island down south, where they sat in shelters that were provided by either the government or the United Nations, like UNICEF and some of the other groups, for about 9 months. You had a large amount of volcanic ash that covered the entire island, even the southern provinces, which damaged roads, right? So when you have a ton of ash and it rains, then you have mudslides and lahars, which were wiping out roads and bridges, similar to what's going on in Kentucky kind of more recently. There was damage to hospitals, and ultimately a number of homes were impacted. So far left, you can kind of see a map. It's like an upside down egg, right? The fat part's at the bottom, the skinny part's at the top. The volcano is kind of in the middle of that red section. And everything in red had significant damage from the eruption, right? The amount of ash that was there was massive. Same thing in the orange and the yellow zones. Ultimately everything on the island was covered, but maybe in the green sections, you might have had like 4 or 5 inches versus, 2 feet of ash up in the northern provinces. Volcanic ash, as you can see in that middle picture, you can see the tile floor and you can see how high that was part of a lahar that came down and flooded this house with volcanic ash. You can see in the roofing picture, it's almost the same consistency as cement. So if you think about a 90-pound bag of cement and you dump that on a roof, how much weight that is if you were spreading several inches of that on a roof. In the very bottom right picture, you can kind of see what happened to a number of the houses and buildings in the island. Is that one, the building codes, again, like you have these corrugated steel roofs or corrugated iron roof on a simple truss framework. There's maybe not a good rebar reinforcement in the masonry, maybe even that the blocks aren't built to a certain compressive strength. So as that weight buckles the wall and pushes out on it, it causes the building to fail. And in many cases, the entire building failed. Like it failed and fell in and collapsed. So it was a total loss. So we kind of came in and said, how can we figure out a way to help? And ultimately, one of the things we were looking at is how can we upcycle some of this volcanic ash to make concrete blocks to help rebuild some of the infrastructure, both the homes, the hospitals, and the schools that were damaged at a cheaper cost. Also, how can we save money in the response? Because ultimately somebody's got to go scrape this stuff off the roads, out of the streets and off the buildings. So how can we start to stockpile this stuff super close to the most heavily damaged parts of the country so we can bring in something portable and potentially make blocks out of it? So there's many steps between that, but initially we started with advisory services. We met with the government of St. Vincent and we said, look, you guys need to do some damage assessments and you need a really simple framework. What I would say here is in the US, we look at FEMA and we say, it's not the most efficiently run. There's some flaws. There's some things that we want to make work better. In the developing world, FEMA is the gold standard. So if that tells you about the capacity and capabilities of some of these developing countries, especially in the Caribbean, these small islands that maybe only have 1 or 2 people who work for their like emergency management department, there's not a plan that they're following, right? So we kind of help them by saying like, here's a simple way to categorize damage in like dollar amounts based on like housing size, the structure type, and what like local costs are, so that you can say, okay, this one's a totally destroyed, like to rebuild this is X, right? And then you can start to say, here's how many homes were damaged in each category. Here's the projection of how much it's going to cost us to repair the housing infrastructure for the whole island that was damaged. So as we're doing these assessments, we can kind of like bucket these things in like 4 different categories. It helps us do some simple math and ultimately publish something so that groups like SBP or the UN or other like humanitarian response agencies can start to outreach to their donors and say, hey, here's what the need is and here's what I'm asking you for. Because until that's done, we're just kind of guessing, and ultimately nobody likes to fund something where there's not like hard data that supports it, right? We also provided some technical assistance to the Building Roads and Government Services Authority. This is basically the government entity, like the Ministry of Transportation. They rebuild all the roads and all the like public infrastructure on the island, and we said, hey, you guys are going to be clearing the volcanic ash. What if we can partner with you? What if we can start stockpiling this in certain places and do some testing? Like, how do we work together on this? So we early on had some very productive meetings, and I, only have great things to say about the leadership of this government agency. They responded very quickly and were very receptive to our kind of bogus idea. I picture what it would be like having somebody show up from a different country and tell me like, hey, instead of just cleaning up this ash, like let's do something different with it. I think I would have been pretty skeptical. So I think there was a lot of faith and support from them and trying something. So I'd have to commend them. But 2 is, 3 is we wanted to say, hey, like we want to bring in some block making equipment. We want to start doing some repairs to some homes. So we actually partnered with the government, who's going to be doing a significant lift on some of the repairs here, and saying, what if we supply the blocks? Think about the cost savings per home, right? If it's an average house uses 2,000 to 2,500 blocks, and we can provide those, then you can stretch your funding out and you can build more homes with what you have. And we'll also use some of those blocks to repair some homes, because that's kind of our thing, right? We're a building group. But more importantly, there's more than one volcano in the world. There's 1,300 active volcanoes. So how do we take this program that we're doing here and kind of create a step-by-step manual so that any government, any humanitarian agency can kind of jumpstart it faster and not have to go through all the like hard lessons that we had to get it up and running, so that they can implement it and ultimately save millions to billions of dollars in reconstruction cost, and ultimately carbon emissions from heavy equipment moving stuff farther distances, shipping in blocks from overseas or from other places. So how do we minimize cost in a program by creating a manual that anybody can pick up and follow, that they don't have to be a structural engineer or a specialist in, concrete design to know how to do this? So this is kind of the process flow, right? At SBP, we're Toyota Production System people, we're process people, we follow a process. So if you start from the left, you see there's a volcano, you know that number one, we've got to clean the roads with heavy equipment. Well, that would be very expensive for SBP to try to undertake, to pay for people to use heavy equipment. We know the government has that stuff. So probably an easy lean to ask them, lean on them and say, hey, can you guys use your equipment and do this thing the way we need to do it? Which leads to number two, is where we're gonna put it. Hey, I don't know my way around the island very well, but I'm sure if I can give you some parameters, we don't want to store this stuff super close to the ocean where it can get washed away. Maybe some flat land. Maybe we can put it, maybe there's some flat land around the island that we can find that's close to the impacted communities where we can store it. And how do we store it so it doesn't get washed away? Well, we worked with Ministry of Agriculture here. We planted pumpkin seeds on it. So these pumpkins grew roots in the ash. They shielded it, they protected it from the wind, from the rain, and it's now looks like a lush mountain of ash that we have to dig through to get the ash. So where we kind of picked up was step three, right? We've got to take the ash, we've got to sift it, we've got to, start mixing all of these compounds, the stones, the aggregates, the sand, the cement to make concrete. And then we've got to hire some local laborers, get a block making machine, and start mass producing these blocks. So that became kind of our program design here. And I'll forecast that I knew nothing about concrete before this program. I had known that volcanic ash was how Romans made concrete back in the day. But again, if you walk through what is the process flow to get from A to Z, and you can start identifying what those steps are, it becomes then something easy to develop a program and put structure to. So I would encourage all of you, if you find this super fascinating, is that like everything that we do has a process flow, and it's just our ability to map that out and understand and put structure to it is how we ultimately design a program. And then we can seek funding for that program, then we can implement that program, and we can hopefully cause massive impacts. So this is just some pictures. This is us doing mostly block testing. So we've got to come up with what is the appropriate mix design. And science tells us that there are certain concrete additives or things that we can put in concrete to make them work very well. One of which is fly ash, which is very similar to volcanic ash. And it's typically added at a 15 to 30% ratio. So that gives us kind of a window for what we can start testing parameters on. There's class C's, class F's, and there's certain chemical criteria that I'm not going to bore anybody with. But it allowed us to kind of say well, this is where we should start. And we're testing. And after many, many weeks of testing, ultimately, before we invested any money, we partnered with the government and did some testing at their facilities and found that we could use about 15% of volcanic ash to replace some of the Portland cement in the mixture, which was interesting enough for us to go and continue testing. After several weeks, we're seeing about 20% is probably where we'll land. in a 1-to-5 cement to ratio. The challenge is, of course, anywhere you're doing concrete, you're going to have different raw materials. So the sand and the stones are going to be different, right? Your aggregates. So I think if we had better aggregates, we may be able to increase that, but ultimately that's something that'll have to be problem solved in the ultimate like manual, right? Like no one's going to be able to do exactly the same way, because whatever they're sourcing in a different volcano may have different chemical composition. They may have different aggregates or different sand quality. So there is some level of discovery that has to happen, but ultimately this kind of walks them in on it and says, this is where you can kind of start. And that concludes Caribbean operations to date. I think we have about 9 to 10 minutes for some Q&A. So I will stop running my mouth and see if anybody has any questions, comments, or concerns. None? Man, I'm getting good at this.
Caitlin asked, how did you come up with the idea to mix ash into concrete?
So a few years ago, I was in a very different role at SBP. I was our communications director. I went to the Bahamas, and then I made a career decision that I liked doing operations. So for me, I haven't worked in the trades since I was probably 17 years old. So there was a learning curve. So to jump back in and to run operations, I need to do a lot of refresher on construction, more specifically on resilience and sustainable like practices, right? I get a good warm and fuzzy for how we do certain phases of construction. It's how can we do those things better? So it's really kind of taking that TPS model. How do we have continuous improvement baked into our operations and find solutions that are maybe less obvious? So I spend a lot of time watching YouTube videos and making playlists when I'm laying in bed before I go to bed every night. I take about 30 minutes and I go down the rabbit hole, right? You watch one video and it gives you a recommendation. So about 2 months before the volcanic eruption, I was watching something on volcanic ash and Roman concrete. And actually, like there's a chemical reaction that happens with seawater that makes Roman concrete stronger because it has a crystalline structure from the chemical reaction that happens. So I was like, that's something worth noting. I should write this down. And so watching this volcano erupt, I was like, wow, like, I wonder if this is the perfect opportunity for us to figure out a way, if there's a way we can use volcanic ash to make blocks. And what would be a simple way to do that, right? Maybe it's reducing the transportation cost of shipping the, like, ultimately when you do debris removal, you've got to clear the roads and all the stuff and take it somewhere else. But if we could keep that closer to the communities, maybe there's a cost savings on operators, gas, heavy equipment, we can put it closer, we bring in something portable and we can make them on site. We're saving transportation cost on both ends, both in the cleanup and in the reconstruction, and we're using less cement. So it was kind of like just simple dot connecting. I mean, none of this is new technology. It's actually pretty simple in design, but it's just asking these kind of questions and going through the exercise in your head of how to like put it all together.
Do you have an estimate percentage wise of how much more expensive it is to build in the Bahamas relative to the US?
I mean, off the bat, your building materials are probably marked up 16% just with VAT and duty, plus maybe, well, let's say 20%. You've got shipping costs, put them on a containerized vessel, send them over, plus you've got your import duties of like, basically that's how islands, you don't pay tax on things, you pay tax to import stuff, right? So they get like 16% on everything that comes in, plus the shipping cost. So you're looking at around 20%. So whatever your building materials are stateside, add 20%, that's what you're paying. Labor, again, for us, may be slightly more expensive, but because we've negotiated stuff and we've kind of set some like fixed prices for certain items, it may actually be a little bit cheaper than what some of y'all are paying.
Does the Bahamas have a permitting process or a code process?
There is. One of our big funders, however, is the group that does this. So we've kind of early on done some like strategic partnership with them to show them the quality of work that we do on certain things. So if it's a non-structural repair, there's oftentimes not a inspection. We can send photos and stuff like that to the inspectors directly and they can sign off on it. So it allows us to move fast. So all of that is you have to have good rapport, you have to do good work, and there can be a level of trust, but that may not be an option in some of our stateside operations.
Can you talk about the differences in client services? Were cultural differences a challenge?
I would say one of the benefits of working in the developing world is that there is less entitlement. And I mean that not in a slanderous way, but certainly folks are greatly appreciated. We've served almost 500 clients in the Bahamas. I would say we've probably had 5 bad clients, right? I don't do client services stateside, but I know that that percentage is probably not the same, right? So folks are just happy to get any kind of assistance because they can't rely on their own governments for these type of things. And again, like it's just, these are small islands. They don't have massive GDP. When tourism is turned off and there's no money flowing, folks don't have access to resources and support. So anybody rolling up their sleeves, showing up at their door and helping them out is something that's like greatly appreciative. As far as the process goes, we follow a very similar process. I think the only thing that becomes easier for us is vulnerability, right? Like, you know, these communities are extreme poverty communities. Many of the communities here in St. Vincent, they don't even have working septic systems. So folks have an outhouse behind their house or there's septic drains in the street. So it's vastly different as far as what the standard of living is. So I think it's easier for us to like determine, and also we're not working in a government program that requires massive restrictions on like vetting, right? So we can move a little bit faster with private funding and saying like, it's very clear to me that this is a family in need based on like, there's 8 people living in a 400 square foot house. We should fix this house, right? So I don't need to collect maybe as much documentation, especially if somebody is like a farmer and they grow their own food and that's how they support themselves, or a fisherman who catches fish to support his family and sells a couple extra for a couple bucks. And that's, you know, it's generational property. It's been in the family for multiple generations. It's paid off. It's smaller. So, you know, it's easier to vet clients, I think, in our processes.
And after Hurricane Dorian, you know, I know that for a lot of people living in the Caribbean, not a whole lot of places to evacuate when a massive hurricane is coming. How are people thinking about dealing with or surviving a hurricane the likes of Dorian or something, you know, God forbid, even stronger?
Yeah, so that's I think the number of shelters had like ultimately retrofitting shelters to make them more resilient. There have been a fewer bigger initiatives pushed from like the UN to kind of build more robust emergency shelters, both in the Bahamas and in St. Vincent. As a result, what's interesting about the UN structure is they don't tend to fund like permanent structures, long-term repairs, right? They're in to provide temporary assistance, food, shelter, water, maybe a temporary livelihoods program to put some cash so people can replace some stuff. But there's not investment in repairing homes and structures. So that's kind of where we come in and we say, hey, like, we're a group that does this very well. How can we adapt our model to work in this area? But yeah, there's not really a great plan for that. And I think that that's something that the UN is ultimately looking is how can we build more resilient shelters? Typically shelters are in schools, which then creates, you know, problems when folks are trying to get back in school because so much of the housing hasn't been fixed that folks have nowhere else to go. You know, so yeah, it's a long-term problem that there's not an immediate solution to. What else? Do one more question. Man. Mike Sullivan, you look like you have a question. That's
Always
a
have a
question
question.
face.
What's the local food like in St. Vincent?
Lots of fish and breadfruit. So it's volcanic ash, while it also makes great concrete blocks. It's great for growing, so it's high in nitrates and like phosphates and stuff. That's like in an agricultural sense, great for growing things. So there's tons of mangoes and fruits. There's bananas and plantations and all kinds of stuff. So folks are very self-sufficient and they live off the land and they can minimize their grocery bill and they can only go buy what like essentials like flour and sugar and stuff like that at the grocery. And the rest of it's fished or farmed, right? There's chickens and eggs, and that's the diet.
Cool.
All right. Well, I appreciate everybody joining. Hopefully this was information that was helpful and kind of understanding. Ultimately, we'll watch. It's peak hurricane season right now. We don't know what's coming. I think every other day there's something coming off the coast of Africa that's headed our way. So, while we see storms in the States, the frequency of storms in the Caribbean is even more, that there's these small islands that kind of are out there as the first line of defense. So who knows? It could be, next week, next month, next year, but there more than likely will be another SBP Caribbean response and operating site in the future.
Awesome, Andy, thanks. I think, Ellie, did you have a question? I'm sorry, I just saw there was a note that you might have a question as well. Maybe not. Okay. All right. Well, thank you all so much for joining today. Andy, thanks for such a fantastic lunch and learn. Really incredible work. Can't wait to see how it continues. Y'all have a great rest of your day. Take care.
Take care.